Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Scott McCandless. It is the week of June 17th, and this is your Monday briefing. In addition to the Senate being in this week, the OECD has released further administrative guidance on the Pillar 2 global minimum tax and Amount B of Pillar 1. Plus, we're watching for some significant Supreme Court decisions affecting tax law. We'll have special episodes on these developments. We've discussed the House Ways and Means tax teams in past episodes, and today we're going to do a deeper dive with Andrew Pryor, Managing Director in PwC's Tax Policy Services Practice. Andrew, thank you for being here.
Oh, it's great to be here.
So tax teams, like I said, we've mentioned these before, but could you give us an overview, what they are, how many they are, and what topics they're covering?
Sure. So this is the House Ways and Means Committee Republicans, and back in late April, they announced the formation of these 10 tax teams. So I'll just read them off. They're American manufacturing, working families, American workforce, Main Street, new economy, rural America, community development, supply chains, U.S. innovation, and global competitiveness. And each of these tax teams has a chair and at least one vice chair and several members. The orientation of these tax teams was based on, members expressed areas of interest. And so those tax teams have now been set in motion to begin meeting. This is, an educational effort designed to get members up to speed. The reality is that there are very few members of Congress that were around in 2017, both on committee and off committee. So these members of the tax rating committees need to get up to speed, and then they can be emissaries to the broader House Republican Conference. So education is a major component. The other issue is going to be alignment. There's also been changes in the House GOP conference. It's not the same conference that we had in 2017. So as they're thinking through these issues, they're going to have to think about what is going to be necessary to get the votes in the future to get a bill across the finish line. And so that's a lot of it. And then, of course, developing legislative solutions and potentially putting those out for public response.
Sure, makes sense. So for the companies out there, could you talk about some of the tax teams that might be focused on key issues for them, and maybe starting with domestic?
Yeah, I think one of the tax teams to keep an eye on is the supply chains. Now, it's not immediately obvious, I think, based on the name, but that is the tax team chaired by Carol Miller of West Virginia that's going to be looking at the corporate tax rate, looking at the corporate alternative minimum tax, as well as energy policy. So I think from a domestic standpoint, that's going to be a key one for many of our clients and companies.
Sure, that's going to have a lot on their plate, actually. What about from an international perspective? Which tax teams will be covering some of those key issues? Yeah,
so the two to watch there are U.S. innovation and global competitiveness. And I kind of think of it as kind of a carrot and stick. So on the stick side, you've got the global competitiveness. They're going to be looking at things like GILTI and BEAT, as well as Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. And then on the carrot side, you have the U.S. innovation tax team, which is going to be looking at things like FDII, but also IP repatriation, and just broadly speaking, R&D incentives.
And from a stakeholder perspective, how exactly would companies weigh in with these individual tax teams to the extent they identify one or more tax teams that has a focus area that's of concern to them? What's the process, and what happens to anything that they might submit to these tax teams through that process?
Sure. So back in I think it was mid-November, they did actually announce a website portal for all the tax teams. It's a single point of contact. So the public can submit written comments to the tax teams, identifying what the issue is, and then presumably those will be fielded to the appropriate tax team based on their coverage areas, although there is a lot of overlap, so maybe it goes to everyone. Yeah. And that formal process runs through October 15th. That's the deadline they've set for receiving those written comments. But that's not the only way they can provide input. A lot of the tax teams have expressed interest in hearing from stakeholders through roundtables and listening sessions. And I think some stakeholders have actually already been in to try to explain sort of educationally, what these provisions are, what they mean, and what's important to the business community. And I think that will carry on into the fall, or into the summer and the fall, with these tax teams holding these roundtables and listening sessions. And one thing to note is that these listening sessions and roundtables are expected to occur largely outside of DC. And so there may be opportunities for stakeholders in their districts or in the states of some of these members to provide that input.
To the extent they do provide input, will this be made public? Will it be posted on the portal, or will it be maintained confidential within the tax teams, or do we even know yet?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure. There's no formal announcement about the tax teams generally, although I think there is some notion that they might not be released publicly. But I know Carol Miller made a separate request for input on energy and credits and incentives through the supply chain. So she's got a separate portal that I didn't mention earlier, and she's made it very specific that they're not intending to make any of those written submissions public.
Great.
I know that can sometimes be a hurdle for some people. And she's actually even said they're not planning to release a report or any recommendations. So what we have heard is that the end product of this is really being left up to the tax teams. They could choose to make specific legislative recommendations, or maybe they have some talking points that they release. So what they put out there could even be as much as nothing. There's that option. So we certainly don't expect them to put anything out before the election. I don't think they want to get ahead of the election results and who might be in the White House. So that seems like a pretty clear strategy. But then even afterwards, not clear exactly what we're going to see out of these committees. Again, I think a lot of the focus is on education and building consensus among House Republicans, and less so about coming up with specific legislative solutions, although we could see those in some areas where people have identified perhaps some pain points, particularly with the international provisions, where people have said, we may not have gotten it exactly right, and we want to hear from stakeholders about what those potential legislative fixes would look like.
Sure, makes sense. And finally, Andrew, you had mentioned at the beginning that the tax teams are a product of the House Ways and Means Republicans. What are Democrats doing? What's the Senate doing? What other activities are going on to help prepare for 2025?
Yeah, I mean, there really are four legs to this. You've got the Senate Finance Committee and the House Ways and Means Committee, and within both of those, you've got Democratic and Republican members and their staffs. So the Ways and Means Committee, I think, has been the most forward-leaning and most public about it. I think right behind that would be the Senate Finance Committee Republicans. Senator Crapo, who's the ranking member, has indicated they have formed working groups modeled on a structure that they did in 2015. So I think back then they had 5 working groups. Now I think they've added a 6th because they didn't have energy policy in there before. But it's individual, it's business, it's international. I think they have community development and infrastructure. And so those are some of the working groups. They have not been formally announced, and we don't know who the members are or whoever's chairing that. So the process is a little bit more opaque, but I would anticipate that they too would take stakeholder input, whether through a formal written process or through stakeholder meetings and listening sessions. So I think that's something to keep an eye on. I think the differentiation is Democrats don't have nearly as formal a process, even approaching what the finance Republicans are doing. And I think that just reflects the fact that, much like the Ways and Means Committee, the Finance Committee Republicans have had a lot of turnover. And so there's maybe not a lot of memory about the 2017 tax reform and what it took to get there, as well as maybe not a lot of muscle memory around budget reconciliation, which is going to be key if you have a Republican sweep scenario, which is, I think, a lot of what this is planning for. Whereas on the Democratic side, both on the Ways and Means Committee and on the Finance Committee, Democrats, have a lot more, carryover from 2017. And so I think they feel like they need to have an informal process where they're briefing members and identifying the issues they expect to come up. I mean, everything is on the table. This has been described as the Super Bowl of tax. So it's not just those things that are temporary. It's also going to be things that are, quote unquote, permanent, but nothing's ever really permanent, especially as they're trying to think about how they're going to pay for all this. So they're thinking through these issues as well, but they feel like they've got the muscle memory on budget reconciliation, which they did with the Inflation Reduction Act. And they also feel like they've got that continuity with the 2017 tax reform debate. And they've been laying out their priorities, whether it's through the Treasury Green Book or through the legislation that they've been pursuing with the child tax credit. So they feel, I think they don't necessarily need to have as formal a process, but they're definitely preparing as well.
Makes sense. Andrew, amazing. The battle has been joined already. And thank you so much for these terrific insights. Thank you.
Thank you.
And for our viewers, as I mentioned at the top, there's a lot going on, so stay with Policy on Demand for more as developments unfold. In the meantime, there are several recent episodes linked in the description of this episode, including one about Gen AI strategy and another on tariffs. You won't want to miss those. Thank you for spending this time with us, and we hope you have a great week.